Egypt has a new constitution. Tunisia and Libya have new governments, and Arab activists a new sense of commitment. But 2 years after the so-called Arab Spring, has all that much really changed? That's next on Access Point. Welcome to Access Point. I'm Doug Bernard, filling in for Ayesha Tanzeem. She'll be back again next week. Well, 2 years after the so-called Arab Spring in 2000, leaders in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia have been toppled, and Syria's Bashar al-Assad may soon join that list as well. However, now 2 years after, new questions are coming about what has really changed in the Arab world after the Arab Spring. Now, at the forefront of change has been the nation of Egypt. In 2010, there was general widespread agreement that longtime leader Hosni Mubarak had to go. However, since that point, unity has been shattered, despite Egypt's recent approval of a new constitution. Well, the task for President Mohamed Morsi now seems to be convincing some in his nation that he does not want to install a theocracy, and pretty much everybody else that Egypt remains a good economic bet.
On many Cairo shopping streets, it's hard to tell there's an economic crisis. But at this women's clothing store, manager Abdulaziz Mohammed can see the impact.
When the situation returns to normal, there will be nothing to worry about.
In the last 2 years, prices of items like these are up, and so is unemployment. And with the poverty rate rising from 20% to 25%, businesses are feeling the pinch. Political economics professor Ashraf Mishrif is at London's King's College.
The high political risk associated with the transition has really impacted negatively and led to disinvestment in the country. Some of the companies actually try to find a more stable market to invest their capital in.
In the current political atmosphere, Egypt's new leaders have struggled to turn the economy around, announcing and then canceling tax and price increases and postponing a crucial International Monetary Fund loan because they can't meet the conditions. The mainly Islamist supporters of the new constitution hope it will bring some stability. But the opposition has vowed to keep up the pressure on the streets as parliamentary elections approach, fearing the country will become too religiously conservative. Experts say that will make it difficult for the government to take unpopular steps on the economy and will likely delay any recovery. Al Pessin, VOA News, Cairo.
Well, we're very pleased to welcome to our table here in Washington, D.C., our guests for this next half hour, and of course, inviting you into the conversation as well. Here in Washington at our table, we're pleased to join with David Ottaway. Mr. Ottaway is senior scholar at the Wilson Center's Middle East program here in Washington. He's also long covered the Arab world, first as a correspondent, now as a scholar and a researcher, and he's the author of the book published in 2008, The King's Messenger. He's also currently working on a book about the changing Arab world. Also here in Washington, it's a pleasure to welcome Laurel Miller. Ms. Miller is a senior policy analyst at RAND. She's also been the author of several RAND articles. She was the lead author of a RAND study looking at democratization in the Arab world recently. And we're pleased to welcome by Skype. Joining us by Skype is Khairi Abaza. Mr. Abaza is a scholar at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Among his focus areas are democratic reforms in the Arab world. He's also the co-founder of the Center for Liberty in the Middle East. And I want to begin with all of you, if we can, pegging off that story that we just heard and saw. Al Pessin taking a look at the economic impact of all of the turmoil in Egypt. What do you think, and Mr. Abaza, let's begin with you. What do you think the biggest impact or the most important thing is for an Egyptian citizen right now? A democratic government or a healthy economy?
Well, the two are tied together. The hope was to have a democratic government and to improve the economy. I am actually currently in Cairo, where neither is actually accomplished. The country is divided into half the country is against the constitution that is set in place, and the economy is in worse condition. And there is the Egyptian pound is dropping. In 1 week, it dropped about maybe 15%, and the condition did not improve. So we are in a situation where actually Egyptians are extremely disappointed.
Mr. Ottaway, if we can, how do you define this term that I used in the beginning, Arab Spring? Whether you use that term or Arab Awakening or some other term of art, how do you define it, and how do you think it has measured up 2 years in here?
Well, the term can mean many things, and it does to many different people. I mean, spring is when things begin. The revolution began almost in the spring. February is not quite spring here anyway. So it has that kind of connotation. As 2 years later, it's a little difficult to always use the term Arab Spring because we've had a winter and a fall and another spring, and et cetera, et cetera. But I would say it's a term that I'm less and less comfortable with. I like Arab Awakening because it's more open-ended and not defined to a season of the year. But and at this point, you know, it depends on which side of the divide you are, whether you think the spring is still with us or it's turned into a winter.
So which side of the divide do you fall on at this point?
I would say, if we have to use the season analogy, kind of fall.
Okay.
We're kind of between. We're kind of between the spring and the hopes for the spring and the winter, which is kind of the cold season where a lot of hopes are dashed, and we're kind of in between.
I'm seeing a sense of movement, perhaps not in the most optimistic direction, at least from your viewpoint. Laurel Miller, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, this term Arab Spring, what do you think it meant in terms of what happened, what we saw in 2011 and 2012?
Well, I think it's a reasonable metaphor. It does suggest an awakening, sort of coming to life of the polities in these countries. But I think it's important to remember that if you consider the broad sort of historical sweep of democratic transitions in all parts of the world in the last 4 decades, 2 years is not a long period of time. People were, within a few months of these revolutions, people were talking about transitions being derailed and Arab Spring turning to Arab Winter. And I think even 2 years on, that kind of pessimism is misplaced. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be issues ahead and that there haven't been issues ahead, but you can only consider the transitions in the region to be derailed if you expected the rails to be smooth, and no one should have expected the rails to be smooth. And progress is being made. Things have been tumultuous in Egypt, no doubt. The transition process was not well organized. The constitution-making process was flawed in many respects, and yet there have been elections. There is a constitution, flawed that the process may have been, and there will be new elections again in a couple of months, and we have to consider these milestones to be progress even when they're far from perfectly executed.
Laurel Miller is an analyst at RAND. She is joining us for this next half hour, as is David Ottaway and Khairi Abaza joining us from Cairo via Skype. We're taking a look not just at the recent Egypt vote on the Constitution, but also the Arab Spring 2 years on. We put that question to our viewers on our Facebook page. We're going to be sharing some of those thoughts as they're coming in throughout our program. Mr. Abaza, I'm curious your thoughts. You said, now here you are in Cairo. The vote has occurred. What is the sense these days in Cairo? I mean, are people ready to move on? One got that sense from the setup piece that we saw, ready to sort of move on and get down to the business of rebuilding a nation?
Well, In about 3 weeks, there will be the anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution on January 25, and there will be a lot of protests that are being organized. So the issue of the constitution is still, the opposition is still talking about it. The judges, many of them are still on strike and opposing the general prosecutor. So there are still political issues that are unsolved to just move to the economy, and we cannot move to the economy as long as there is no political stability. For instance, the latest protests have affected the tourism industry, the Christmas and New Year season, and the country much needed the hard currency that would have come from this. So as long as the government does not address the core political issues, I don't see how the economy is going to improve, and and that's why there are a lot of anticipation for January 25th, and fear that new waves of protests that will last for long days and weeks, and that will not help in stabilizing the economy. So I don't think in Egypt that now the constitution has been voted and then we're back in business. There are still many political concerns ahead of us.
Mr. Abaza, you're obviously in Cairo, and I know both of you have done research in Cairo and the Arab world. I'm curious the thoughts, though, do Egyptians, because Egypt has really been in some ways at the forefront of what is talked about by Arab Spring, do Egyptians use this term Arab Spring? And do they see what happened in their nation as connected to what's been happening in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Syria, and other places?
I can't speak to the views of Egyptians on this. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Abaza, your thoughts?
Yes. I say absolutely. There is a feeling that everybody's connected, as was seen a couple of years, 2 years ago when this started. But when we say Arab Spring, and despite the difficulties, there is a sense of optimism among everybody, because there is a sense of hope that things can go in the right direction and that things can improve, and so there is this feeling that things will be better, but there are still many issues that Egyptians should fight for and will fight for before they can achieve what they have fought for in the first place 2 years ago. But there is a process going on, and there is the same feeling for the neighboring countries and the Arab world.
Laurel Miller?
I think that ultimately the success or failure of the revolutions are going to be a question of the internal dynamics in each country. And while obviously there was an effect that the revolution in Tunisia had in Egypt and then elsewhere, and a sort of inspirational effect that these revolutions had, and we've seen that happen in other parts of the world as well, ultimately it's the internal dynamics in each country, the political and economic dynamics that are going to be the dominant ones. And each of these individual political transition processes is going to stand or fall on its own based on the circumstances in each country.
So, Mr. Ottaway, the Arab Spring, or the Arab Awakening, really began in Tunisia back in 2010, and it led to the ouster of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. What path has Tunisia taken in those 2 years?
Well, Tunisia has totally different circumstances, which you have to take it country by country as to what's happened. I mean, in Tunisia, the Islamists never had a majority, as they have acquired in Egypt. And they had to rule in a coalition with two secular parties. And so the dynamics are totally different. The military has played no role in Tunisia, except helping to get rid of Ben Ali by not following his orders to open fire on the crowds. So Tunisia's, it's got different internal dynamics. It's been difficult between Ennahda, the Islamic Party, and the two secular parties. But the fact is they have to reach a compromise. Now, in Egypt, the Freedom and Justice Party of the Muslim Brotherhood, they have an absolute majority. So they can force through whatever they want to do at a cost.
What cost? What is that
cost? The cost is that the liberal secularists are going to fight it all the way. and there will continue to be in Egypt a kind of bipolar society between the Islamists and the secular liberals. And they've got to figure out some way to start the dialogue that the Tunisians, right from the beginning, had to undertake because Ennahda did not have a majority in the elections.
I'm just now reminded of something that you wrote. This was in the Wilson Quarterly back in late 2010. You had this to say, that, quote, "The world now stares at two sharply contrasting models of its future. The highly materialistic emirate state, obsessed with visions of Western-style modernity, and the strict Islamic one fixed on resurrecting the Quran's dictates as espoused by fundamentalists and Al-Qaeda." Those words seem still to fit, and unless I'm misunderstanding you, 2 years later. I'm not hearing a lot that's different.
No, except that they have to come to grips with each other. I mean, they're now living side by side and trying to figure out how to deal with each other. Right. And that is different from 2010 when you could conceptualize these differences. But now it's real. I mean, they have to figure out whether to have a national dialogue in Egypt or continue fighting each other. And Morsi said, let's have a national dialogue. And the opposition in Egypt that's now in a coalition have been very reticent about joining in any kind of dialogue with Morsi and trying to figure out some compromise.
As I mentioned earlier, we asked some of our Facebook fans to offer their comments as well. A number of you have done so. And this one, I'm just going to throw this out for who might want to respond. Javaid Iqbal says very simply that the U.S. is responsible for the Arab Spring. Is this something that any of you have heard before?
Well, people say all sorts of things, but I think that far overstates U.S. ability to influence events in the region. And it's also difficult to see what what motivation there would be for influencing events in the particular direction that they've gone.
Khairi Abaza, let me turn the question on its head. How well or poorly do you think the United States in general has responded, particularly to the case of Egypt, but your thoughts also on the other states that we've seen that have been caught up in the Arab Spring?
Well, regarding Egypt at the beginning, I think the U.S. government did the right thing by trying to support the democratic aspirations of the Egyptian people. However, after that, I am not really impressed by the performance of the U.S. government, letting the Egyptian military design a transition that led to the many difficulties that Egypt is experiencing today. The U.S. government has very strong ties to the Egyptian military, and it could have used its relations with it to try and design the process that called for drafting a constitution first and then allowing a period of certain period of transition to level the political field and then have general elections, and not the other way around. And it is this poorly designed process that led to the polarization of the political scene today. So for that reason, I don't think that the U.S. administration managed this this transition in the way it could have influenced it in a much better way, for much better outcome and for a much better for more stable Egypt. For other countries, it is sorry.
Oh, no, that's quite okay. Actually, we're going to turn to some other countries right now. This was another comment that came in on our Facebook page. Looks like Jamil Afridi wrote that, yes, the Arab Spring has, in fact, brought real change in Egypt, but also, he says, real change in Syria, as the change is being made by a majority of the population. So I'm curious, I want to turn to each of you now, and starting with you, Laurel Miller. In general, before we turn to the specific case of Syria, do you think that the populations in these nations, in these Arab states, have felt empowered, have felt motivated, have sort of that, that basic civil or civic language to engage and know how to affect the kinds of changes that they may want?
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of popular mobilization in the streets, and it is very impressive that that the changes were prompted and affected by popular movements, by pressure from the streets. And I think that's important, not just in terms of the revolutions themselves, but for example, the continuing process of protest and pressure that we see in Egypt is important for keeping the momentum, for keeping the transition on track. Now, actually enabling and empowering groups in society to be agents of change is another thing, and that requires more organized civil society, which has been developing in Egypt and Tunisia in particular. But it also requires those in charge of the transitions to create avenues for groups in civil society to have a say in the process. And it's disappointing, for example, that the constitution-making process in Egypt did not create more opportunities for direct engagement with civil society and more opportunities for even educating the population about the text on which they were asked to vote. A draft was put before them, an up or down vote, without any kind of civic education process like we've seen in some other constitution-making processes around the world.
Right. I mean, mobs don't form the basis of a sustainable government.
No, but I wouldn't consider these mobs. I mean, there have been organized protests, and there's been popular pressure, and and I think that's on the whole a positive.
If we can, David Ottaway, I'm curious your thoughts, turning not that far away to a country that took a very different route and has ended up in a very different place, and that is Libya.
Well, each country has its own special circumstances, and Libya's was certainly special. They had no institutions. They had a leader who absorbed everything in terms of the political process. And that whole system has been destroyed, and there's kind of tabula rasa.
Right.
And they've got to start from the bottom, building institutions, very complicated. And they have regional forces pulling them apart, tribal forces pulling them apart. So it's a very, special circumstances in Libya. And, the Arab Spring or the awakening, you have to take into account in each country, it's sort of the national narrative, what they're coming out of and the circumstances on the ground in which these uprisings took place. And they're going in different paths in different directions.
How much instability do you think is normal or acceptable in situations like this, where long-time strongmen rulers are being deposed and there's really not a lot to fill the vacuum, fill the void?
In many past cases, transitions have been very chaotic, and sometimes they look much more inevitably successful in retrospect than they seemed at the time. And it's easy, once the process of the political process is normalized and stabilized, to forget how chaotic the process was. And to give you one example, Portugal in the 1970s had an extremely chaotic transition process. There were 6 different transitional governments within a year and a half. There were massive purges, not only in the public sector, but in the private sector, very polarized politically, and that's easily forgotten once the process stabilized. And obviously they had certain advantages being in Europe, but other processes have been chaotic as well. A number of countries have seen very severe economic crises in the aftermath of a political transition, and sometimes this has led to the early changes of government, though generally those have not led to a reversion to authoritarianism, but they have contributed to political uncertainty and unrest for a sustained period of time.
Khairi Abaza, I'm curious your thoughts as to what sort of pressures are being put on Mohamed Morsi right now, and specifically these kinds of civic economic pressures that we heard about a little bit earlier, and whether that may be pushing the regime, the current regime, one way or the other.
Yes. Currently, the economy is the main issue and the main problem. There are certain, the government succeeded in securing a loan from international financial institution that requires very difficult measures, such as removing some subsidies, adding taxes to reform the economy. And the problem is he has been so weakened by the process of adopting the new constitution that he is not able to take the very difficult measures that will put the economy in the right track. So it is he's faced with a very difficult choice. That is either to follow up with his the Muslim Brotherhood's political plan of trying to have it their way without compromising and without finding solution to the opposition, or to try and find a compromise and include the opposition so that he can take the tough economic measures that can put the country in the right track. So right now, he does not seem to be doing this, and the economy, as we speak, the Egyptian pound is dropping every day. I've been here since I arrived here over a week ago. We reached today maybe an increase of around 15%, and it's still dropping. So the fear is that we have a second wave of protest, but this time the protest would be more hunger protests, not protests for more democracy and freedom. So we are facing a very critical stage that I think will force the government to cooperate with everyone when they will realize how serious and severe the crisis that we will be facing in the next coming weeks.
David Ottaway, do you expect those same kinds of pressures, or these same kinds of dynamics to be on display in other nations that have seen change recently through this Arab Spring?
Well, in Tunisia, you have the same problem, the same pressures. And you have a lot of pressure from the labor unions to raise salaries and provide more social services, and the government doesn't have the wherewithal to do this. So that you find the same kind of confrontation over economic issues as we're seeing now in Egypt. The scale is smaller because Egypt's much smaller. But the problem is the same, and that is that you unleash the voice of the voiceless. Well, they used to be voiceless, and they're all making demands. They want higher salaries, they want jobs, things that the government cannot provide. And it's a real challenge, and it's the same in Tunisia as it is in Egypt.
Is it just me, or does it seem that the fate of the strongmen rulers has taken a very different path than those of the monarchy? I can't think of a single monarchy that's been toppled or maybe even perhaps seriously challenged.
Well, a couple of them have been savvy. I mean, if we look at Morocco, for example, there were initially some protests there, more modestly scaled than elsewhere, but the monarchy there responded with some liberalizing changes, constitutional changes, new elections, and Jordan is the other example of that as well. What ultimately those will mean in terms of true democratization is yet to be seen, but for the time being at least, they seem to have taken the wind out of the sails of opposition.
We only have a few minutes left, and I'm curious for your final thoughts from each of you on this question. What is either the most positive or the most negative sign that you've seen over these last 2 years regarding these massive changes we've seen across the Arab world? Laurel Miller, if I may begin with you.
I think that the positive news outweighs the negative news in my mind. As I said, I think one should have expected from the very beginning that these would be very difficult processes, that they would take a long time. But I think leaving aside Syria, which is another story altogether, the trajectory has been in a forward direction.
David Ottaway, in 20
On the one
seconds.
hand, on the other hand, the voiceless now have a voice, but the tendency towards reinstalling autocratic authoritarian regimes is very strong. and participation in the process is going down.
Khairi Abaza, do you have 10 seconds, some thoughts to share?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's overall a positive process. People are increasingly involved in politics. People are learning fast. Discussing a constitution in Egypt or constitutional articles in Egypt was unthinkable a few years ago. Now people are learning. They are participating.
We're going to have to leave it there.
It is a difficult process.
I'm so sorry. Khairi Abaza, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks also to David Ottaway and Laurel Miller. And thank you so much for joining us for Access Point. We'll be back again with you next week. See you then. Egypt has a new constitution. Tunisia and Libya have new governments, and Arab activists a new sense of commitment. But 2 years after the so-called Arab Spring, has all that much really changed? That's next on Access Point. Welcome to Access Point. I'm Doug Bernard, filling in for Ayesha Tanzeem. She'll be back again next week. Well, 2 years after the so-called Arab Spring in 2000, leaders in Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia have been toppled, and Syria's Bashar al-Assad may soon join that list as well. However, now 2 years after, new questions are coming about what has really changed in the Arab world after the Arab Spring. Now, at the forefront of change has been the nation of Egypt. In 2010, there was general widespread agreement that longtime leader Hosni Mubarak is Khairi Abaza. Mr. Abaza is a scholar at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Among his focus areas are democratic reforms in the Arab world. He's also the co-founder of the Center for Liberty in the Middle East. And I want to begin with all of you, if we can, pegging off that story that we just heard and saw. Al Pessin taking a look at the economic impact of all of the turmoil in Egypt. What do you think, and Mr. Abaza, let's begin with you. What do you think the biggest impact or the most important thing is for an Egyptian citizen right now? A democratic government or a healthy economy?
Well, the two are tied together. The hope was to have a democratic government and to improve the economy. I am actually currently in Cairo, where
had to go. However, since that point, unity has been shattered, despite Egypt's recent approval of a new constitution. Well, the task for President Mohamed Morsi now seems to be convincing some in his nation that he does not want to install a theocracy, and pretty much everybody else that Egypt remains a good economic bet.
On many Cairo shopping streets, it's hard to tell there's an economic crisis. But at this women's clothing store, manager Abdulaziz Mohammed can see the impact.
When the situation returns to normal, there will be nothing to worry about.
In the last 2 years, prices of items like these are up, and so is unemployment. And with the poverty rate rising from 20% to 25%, businesses are feeling the pinch. Political economics professor Ashraf Mishrif is at London's King's College.
The high
recovery. Al Pessin, VOA News, Cairo.
Well, we're very pleased to welcome to our table here in Washington, D.C., our guests for this next half hour, and of course, inviting you into the conversation as well. Here in Washington at our table, we're pleased to join with David Ottaway. Mr. Ottaway is senior scholar at the Wilson Center's Middle East program here in Washington. He's also long covered the Arab world, first as a correspondent, now as a scholar and a researcher, and he's the author of the book published in 2008, The King's Messenger. He's also currently working on a book about the changing Arab world. Also here in Washington, it's a pleasure to welcome Laurel Miller. Ms. Miller is a senior policy analyst at RAND. She's also been the author of several RAND articles. She was the lead author of a RAND study looking at democratization in the Arab world recently. And we're pleased to welcome by Skype. Joining us by Skype,
political risk associated with the transition has really impacted negatively and led to disinvestment in the country. Some of the companies actually try to find a more stable market to invest their capital.
In the current political atmosphere, Egypt's new leaders have struggled to turn the economy around, announcing and then canceling tax and price increases and postponing a crucial International Monetary Fund loan because they can't meet the conditions. The mainly Islamist supporters of the new constitution hope it will bring some stability. But the opposition has vowed to keep up the pressure on the streets as parliamentary elections approach, fearing the country will become too religiously conservative. Experts say that will make it difficult for the government to take unpopular steps on the economy and will likely delay any